Welcome back to Define the Relationship podcast, our special series on the 25-year history of Seeds Church, a memoir. And good news is we're today going to be chronicling the 2015 phase to 2020. And the good news is that is much closer to today. Bad news is we still are having trouble recollecting things, which is kind of funny. But what do we want to dive into today, Darlene?
So the three things we want to cover today are the Syrian refugee sponsorships in our community, wider community, but also Seeds specifically took responsibility and welcomed in one very large family, the Hammam family.
Right.
13 people. That was in 2015.
Yes.
And in our previous episode with Ray, we talked a little bit about that. So maybe we won't dig into that too much, but let me just get the three areas out.
Yeah.
So Syrian refugee welcome. We really worked hard at clarifying who we were at Seeds, and specifically around Patrick Lencioni's 6 critical questions.
Yeah.
And so we can talk a little bit about that. And then also during that 5-year period, there were some significant things around processing sexual orientation, gender, church engagement, like where do we find ourselves, and how do we articulate our welcome?
Sounds like...
Yeah, so those are all three really big things that happened in those 5 years. And really, when you think about it, I guess that was all pre-COVID.
Yep, it was all pre-COVID, which we'll get into next episode. You'll be looking forward to that, the COVID years starting to 2020, but this is all pre-COVID. So what I remember about the Syrian refugee crisis, as with our interview with Ray Lowen in the last episode, obviously we'd been involved as a community and as a congregation in supporting refugees, and we had sponsored refugees. We had teams of people at Seed support refugees from different parts of the world. And in 2015, I believe in the fall of 2015, there was a very evocative, provocative image that had a really strong impact on North American people. And many of you probably remember it was a very, very tragic image of a young child who had washed up on the shore. I'm assuming like this is in Greece or somewhere like that, because of people who tried to flee the Syrian conflict, and many people drowned trying to get across the channel into Europe, and so it had the impact, I believe, to the population at large, but also to political leaders, where people felt like there was a real need to open up space to respond to have refugees come to our country here in Canada. I think at the time the commitment was like for 50,000 Syrian refugees to come quite quickly, and many parts of the world. There was millions that went to Europe, and the United States had a lot of people too. So. Build a Village, and in turn Seeds Church, because we are one of the churches a part of Build a Village, we made a commitment to accept 5 families from Syria. And like you just said, one of the families had 13 people. There was like a family of 13, a family of 11, a family of 9, a family of 5, altogether almost 50 people. I remember. I remember when sitting around the table at Build a Village, when we made that decision that we would say yes to 5 families. It felt big. And I
think maybe it should be said that taking responsibility for financial support for each family. And then equally as important, the model that we've used as Build a Village is to create a team, a support team to come around, essentially to wrap around a family and walk with them from the start.
Yeah.
In that, particularly in that first year. So it's very relationally oriented, and we had a team of people from Seeds supporting this 13-person family, and some people on the team focused their energies on medical, and some was on language and job, and some was on house, you know, and just everything from grocery shopping to everything that's involved in helping someone to settle in a new place. And it also involves lots of tea. So much tea.
Yeah, lots of caffeinated tea.
Yeah.
It was, I think it was in January of 2016.
Of course, they always come in the middle of winter and freezing
Welcome
cold.
to Canada.
We welcome Jim Griffith in the middle of winter. We welcome refugees in the middle of winter.
Well, ironically, I feel like, surprisingly, actually, how many people who come from what we perceive to be very warm climates, how many of them aren't that fazed with winter, and many of them talk about how much they love winter and they love the cold. And
well, particularly the Hammam family, they love winter. They have not been afraid of it at all.
Yeah. So, what are some of the, I mean, I'm just thinking memories of when they arrived at the Winnipeg airport. We had a pretty large welcoming contingent. Many of the people welcoming were people from the Middle East who had settled in Altona, and so they could speak Arabic and help us translate. And many of us local Altona people there too. And then a family of 13 who had just been traveling for a couple of days, and overwhelmed family that arrived.
Yeah, and you never know what a family is coming with. There's actually very little you know about their history, and families often don't have language when they come, and so it is both such a challenging and complex place to enter into and to be allowed in. Mm-hmm. Over the 25 years, I just feel like some of my most sacred encounters have been with newcomer families. And I could probably get really emotional really quickly about some of our experiences with newcomer families, but particularly with the Hammam family, I just, so their youngest child was 7 months old, and very shortly after they arrived, he got sick. And I remember getting a phone call or a message somehow late at night or in the middle of the night even, and then going in an ambulance with wee dad and their little baby, and just seeing that terror of not knowing another country and another language, and she had known me for 3 days. Yeah. And here we were kind of flung into an emergency situation, and I never take or try not to take for granted that vulnerability and what they did to welcome us. So we always talk about we welcome them, but wow.
Yeah. The trust that they have to put into supporters that are there to help them. It's quite something.
Yeah, I remember Ramadan celebrations and like going over to somebody's house at 10 o'clock at night to celebrate the breaking of the fast, and dancing and drumming and eating incredible food. It's sometimes just really different food.
Yeah.
Some of it's like, this is amazing. And some of it, I think you feel a little bit like, I don't know if I love all of this food.
Well, it's like all food.
Yeah.
It's not for everybody. One thing I remember about this large family is, and Ray mentioned this, about how hard it was to find housing. Like normally housing that you have is 2-bedroom suites and things like that. Small houses maybe. How do you house 13 people without having a massive house? And that did come together, and we were able to prepare the house a couple of days before they arrived. And one of the things that, now I'm remembering, this should actually be a fourth thing that we talk about in this episode, is that during 2015 to 2000 was when Seed started a practice of doing weekly communion, which is a very different thing for Protestant or Mennonite congregations to do. And so we were having community, and as part of that, a number of people from our congregation built a large communion table. And those same people, Paul Peters and Jason Peters, built a massive table that would fit 13 people around it, so that we would have a proper table for the Hammam family. And so part of setting up their house was moving that big table in there. And it was kind of a cool image of, extending the table, creating more room. And in the decade, less than a decade that they've been here, I mean, how many humongous feasts have we enjoyed in their presence? Although,
and ironically, we had to get rid of the table because they eat on the floor.
Yeah. So now we no longer, the table was used for something else, and we need even more room. So often we will, their new setup will sit on the floor and enjoy a feast. So it's kind of cool.
Lots of layers of how they shaped us as a faith community, and how Muslim people have shaped us as a Christian community.
Yeah.
And opened our hearts and taught us about generosity, and given us the freedom to, or given us the ability to be ourselves and let them be themselves, and to respect that. And yeah, there's a lot of amazing messages in having relationships and fostering relationships with people of different faiths and different cultures, and very humbling experience.
Yeah. So true. So true.
We could probably talk a long time about that stuff, but let's move on.
Yeah, make sure to listen to the interview with Ray Lowen, because get into some of the dynamics of that. And also, if I'm going to remember to put the link to the Globe and Mail on the 1-year kind of anniversary of the Syrian refugees coming to Canada, did a major July 1st piece in the Globe and Mail, and they made a video. I'm going to put the link to the video because it'll bring back some memories of those early days, and you'll see many people from Altona, including many Seeds people in that video, and also some of the Syrian families. So, I mentioned the communion stuff. It's kind of a little bit of a different, more of like our local church life at Seeds. Do you remember at all how we kind of came to this practice of communion on a weekly basis? I mean, what I do remember is there was a time when we practiced communion, not very often. It was almost like we didn't have a natural rhythm of when to do it. And traditionally, Mennonite churches would do communion maybe 3 to 5 times a year. And I'm sure sometimes we only did communion a couple of times a year. What happened to shift us and to ask about what would it look like to do communion every week?
I don't know. I don't, just as we're sitting here chatting, I wonder if it had something to do with a sense that we were very aware of how disconnected people were, that there's a deep longing for connection, and yet what brings us together? And I think maybe we talked about, maybe the table kind of puts us into this place where it brings us together around the circle and focuses us on the body of Christ, and what it means to feast there and to live a connected relational life from that place. I don't know. I remember it was experimental again to say, let's just try doing it for like a month or two, and do it every Sunday and see what it feels like. And we just kept doing it.
Yeah. And we're still doing it today.
Yeah.
Part of that conversation too was a very intentional wanting to emphasize the openness of the table. And so we decided that it would be open to anybody who wanted to come to the table, including children, young children. And it's one of the beautiful things about communion is going around and young children putting out their hands to receive the bread and to dip it into the juice. And
theologically, there was also a lot of deconstructing of, this is how people grew up with communion. There's, these fences around it, and how that impacted people. So, we have our traditions of how we grew up with it, like you and I, and then other people would also talk about. And I think we cared a lot about what are the obstacles to relationship with God. And we felt pretty called for this to be an open space. And well, how open, right? So lots of good conversations about that. But in a way, because we never had membership, so we would have grown up with the practice of you take communion once you're baptized, and once you're, and if baptism is tied to membership, then you can take communion as a member. So when you don't have membership at Seeds, and I don't even know if we talked about this in past episodes, but
good time to talk about it,
because right from the beginning, we kind of struggled with the obstacles of membership, and decided to experiment with not having membership. Then also, in some ways, when you think about other ways that people serve and are involved in a church community, if you don't have membership, then it kind of opens the door a little bit to who can be a part. And like, I think about Eugene Leckman here, like as soon as you walk through the door, he's said this a couple times. He says we said it, I think, but I remember him reminding us of it even a couple of weeks ago. Once you've walked through the door, like, you're a part of us. And once you've had any connection with anybody at Seeds, you're in.
Yeah.
So
yeah. On one hand, we can really pad the numbers because, if you've breathed the air of anything at Seeds, you're a part of us. But it just, I think early on we wrestled with, what should there be any sort of commitments that one has to make to become a part of the community? And we just seem to experience that obstacles to belonging, where there's a lot of them, and often some of the most important ones are inside of ourselves. So we don't need to put anything intentionally and that's keeping people away from doing something. Like lots of people make a conscious decision not to come to the table and participate, and that's perfectly fine. Like they're making that choice with integrity. And if a person believes or feels called or drawn to the table, then that they should be allowed to move on that. It's actually just recently we talked about this before having communion, and a person who's been connected to Seeds for quite a while. And I guess the way we talked about it that morning really emphasized how there's no barriers. And they came up after the service and said, that's like, I'm so glad you said what you said, because it shifted something for me in that moment around coming to the table. And there was some background history around, you needed to really be, for lack of a better way of putting it, you really need to put yourself together.
Yeah.
You had to be good enough.
Right.
You had to be good enough to come to the table. And I think part of the emphasis that Seeds has fostered is that there's partly something happens to us when we come to the table that starts to make us right.
That's right.
It makes us whole. It starts to save us. Mm-hmm. So if all the work has to happen before you come to the table, boy, you might never get there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And you can come to the table and still feel like you're lacking many things, but it's a meal to nourish us and to connect us to God through Jesus and to connect us together. That's why we do it in a circle and look at each other. And so yeah, it's been a very cool experiment that has become more than that. It's
yeah, good stuff.
But maybe this is a good segue from this to talk to the next. Well, do we want to talk about LGBTQ plus inclusion conversation? We talked about the openness of the table, and then you raised the question, Darlene, how open? And maybe this is part of why we were drawn to have a conversation around LGBTQ plus inclusion in the church during this period of time. It probably started before 2015. What do you think we need to talk about in terms of that process? I think it was a very significant process for us as leaders and then as a congregation. How do you remember that happening?
The theology of inclusion really comes prior to, then you just apply it. I think when we started talking specifically around sexual orientation, it was more about applying what we were already experiencing, the God we were encountering, the openness, the call to inclusion. Then it's like, well, how does it fit here? And somebody said, this, I'm not following in order, but somebody at one point said, when we raised a question, like, if Seeds would say that it is not open to people in the rainbow community, then there's a problem, because it has this stance in everything else. And if it would not have this stance, then that would be kind of problematic. I thought that was I hadn't really thought about it that way, but.
Yeah. So it was sort of like they were saying that we would be not true to
ourselves,
our values that we have.
Yeah.
But we should sort of move back a little bit, because part of the need for a conversation over a significant period of time would sort of, like, it sort of highlights or emphasizes that people are coming from very different places in relationship to this. We come with different backgrounds. The saying, well, that's not how I was brought up. We had to deal with a congregation where people were on a spectrum of how they viewed queer rainbow community inclusion in the church. And, we really felt like, okay, this is a conversation that has to be handled with wisdom, and allow people who see things or believe things very differently can have a conversation and not end up kind of tearing our community apart, or finding people saying like, well, this just isn't a safe place for me because I can't believe what I believe here.
And that's where, the beginning of the real conversation at Seeds started. There was lots of probably informal conversations, but the real beginning of the process for Seeds was through a book called Love is an Orientation by Andrew Marin. And our practice throughout the whole process of this conversation was that we had the people in leadership engaged with the book, Love is an Orientation. And the basis for this book, obviously we have to be kind of concise here, but is the question of how to elevate the conversation. So it's very easy for a conversation around sexual orientation to become polarized so quickly because people, as you said, grew up in this way or have this understanding of the Bible and God and what is right and wrong. And Love is an Orientation, the book, pushed, or its primary emphasis was to elevate the conversation around it. And that was absolutely, I want to say, life-changing for us. Because we were seeing, even in our Mennonite denomination, the being a faithful church process didn't really see, in my experience, a lot of positive outcomes of that. It's kind of like, well, we're trying to get to, is this right or is this wrong? Right. It's kind of like, this is difficult. It's difficult to elevate a conversation if the goal of the conversation is to arrive at the right answer.
Right.
So Love is an Orientation helped us. So we engaged the book. Our leadership team engaged the book first. That was intense and beautiful and hard, but mostly beautiful. No expectation for people to be at a certain place. Right. Just wanted to create the space to have a safe conversation, to ask good questions. So we did that with the leadership team. Then we fanned out and opened it up to the whole community, the congregation, and went through a process then. So that was the start. We had different phases in this conversation and how we moved. But am I saying it?
Yeah,
right?
No, I mean, it felt like the first sort of, let's call it the first phase of the conversation was allowing people to explore some different perspectives, hearing from people who are part of the queer community, but also part of the church community in North America. So there was lots of hearing testimonies from people about what their experience was and how they longed to be faithful part of the congregations, and also let people who maybe didn't feel good about that kind of inclusion, and let people kind of say about like what they wondered about, and what do we do with some of the scriptures that seem to speak against this kind of perspective, and creating a space where the conversation could happen and people wouldn't be excluded wherever they found themselves, but given space to process. And then it felt like that gave us the opportunity to now explore a little bit more, like what would it look like if the church was more including of people in the rainbow community. And so we did another Loves and Orientation kind of round with leadership and then the whole congregation, with people who changed their mind, like church leaders and churches who changed their mind and moved from exclusion to inclusion, full inclusion of the LGBTQ plus community in their communities. And once we had that conversation, it was another opportunity to sort of, okay, well, how does someone feel about that? And what do they think? And more processing. And then it kind of came eventually to that very point that you mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, that somebody said, well, I don't think we could really be who we are as a community if we would not move to full inclusion of the rainbow community in our church. And so this happened during the COVID years when we weren't meeting in person. We finally got to the place where we realized it was time to make a commitment to full inclusion, to become an affirming church. And we were able to move on that with, I'd say, a significant amount of consensus as a congregation. No, not, of course, some people didn't feel comfortable with that and chose to move to a different community, which is too bad. But also that seemed to happen in a way that wasn't destructive or relationship disconnecting. It was also done with a lot of, where the orientation seemed to be love from both sides.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think and as we've gone along in the journey, I think how we've understood things continues to grow too, because we're still learning. And a significant part in this last step of becoming fully affirming is that, I think prior to that, we had this sense that, well, if people connect with C's, they know we're just like, we're open, and we believe that Jesus modeled for us a radically open posture. And but when we tested it with some people in the rainbow community, we got some feedback that, if I don't see explicitly that I'm welcome here, I will not assume that I'm welcome.
Yeah.
And that was a window into the reality of safety.
Yeah.
And I think that really moved us into the next step. And a lot of Bible study, a lot of because that conviction comes out of, it doesn't just come out of, well, we think we should just accept people. It comes out of how we understand the Bible, how we understand the ancient scriptures, and how we read them. So it also feels like a lot of things are tied into that obviously we can't go into in full detail on this podcast, but led us into some good biblical work, I think.
Yeah, and I think some of the earlier episodes of this Define the Relationship podcast, if we go back to the beginning, those early, 10 or 20 episodes were focused on how we read the Bible. And there's even one of the episodes, I'm not sure which episode it is, but there's an episode that talks about our move to full inclusion of the rainbow community into our community. And there's some good stuff there if you're wanting to learn a bit more about the process. I think I'm feeling like this is enough for today on this one. I think we could probably talk about the clarity stuff in the next piece.
Oh, thanks for joining us then. We'll in the next episode, we'll talk about the clarity of our playground, which is our DNA.
Yeah, and we have a special bonus episode related to this one. We're going to be sitting down with Rick Hepner-Mueller, who has been at Seed since the beginning and involved in the music and worship area of our congregation. And we're going to talk a little bit about the evolutions and changes that we've gone through in that part of our community. So look for that.